our third session of the day. This is a marathon for those of you who are sticking with us. We're not quite at the halfway mark yet. We are joined right now by Michelle Tan and Judith Athaide, who are going to take us on the journey of the view from the boardroom on the issue of stakeholder capitalism and how we find the right balance in our conversation and our tackling of the topic. So this is, I think, a wonderful opportunity for us as a group to hear from a truly global perspective. Both Michelle and Judith are going to give you the opportunity to hear about both U.S. and Canadian concerns in a much more specific way than you perhaps have heard about them recently. And I personally think the ability to compare and contrast and have a broader frame of reference really expands our thinking a great deal. So let me take a moment to do just a little bit of housekeeping. First, as in other sessions, if you've got questions, please type them into the Q&A box and we will incorporate them as we can. If we don't get to your question, Michelle's going to coordinate replying to you. So just make sure that we have your permission to do so. Let me not spend any time talking about the background of these two incredible human beings. Michelle is a partner at Hugeson, and Judith is a corporate director of, I think it's 5 boards right now, but I may be a little bit off in my count, Judith. And I encourage you to download both of their bios to understand just the depth of experience and knowledge that both Michelle and Judith are bringing today. So I'm looking forward to a very robust conversation on this topic. And with that, I think, Michelle, you're going to take us off.
Thanks, Lisa. And welcome, everyone. I am similarly very excited to share with you the conversation that Judith and I have had as we've been preparing for this session. It is a vast topic. We have gone down, I will, no word of a lie, that we've gone down some pretty big and deep rabbit holes, but we are looking forward to trying bringing this together into a conversation that will be helpful and sort of of value to you. To make the best use of time, I do want to note that we're going to talk to a number of topics that we think are clear from the lens of the director and the boardroom for about sort of the first 20 to 25 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to your questions and sort of see what it is you want to hear. Judith has extensive experience in the boardroom across a number of industries and companies. And so we want to make sure that you get full benefit to that. I do have a couple of sort of like anchor slides for our conversation, and I'm going to get started with just a bit of a sort of background to sort of like kick off this part of the discussion here. A couple of topics that we want to sort of cover off here, and then obviously the Q&A piece of it. So it's been 2 years since the Business Roundtable announced their move away from shareholder primacy with the revised statement on the purpose of a corporation. And I thought not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but thought it would be helpful as a reminder to refocus everyone on sort of the breadth of that commitment for leading companies to the benefit of all stakeholders, customers, employees, shareholders, communities. It's a broad community that we're talking about here. Also want to sort of like just put out there that at the time of this statement, you may recall that the Council of Institutional Shareholders came out against the new statement. And on one hand, not surprising given sort of who they represent, and yet a little bit ironic from my personal perspective when you consider the increasingly loud voice that the institutional shareholders are putting out there in terms of engaging with companies on a wide range of government governance, environmental, social, sustainability topics on behalf of other stakeholders, not just the institutional shareholder perspective. And a lot of their opposition did stem from a concern about accountability. And then you may have also seen just a couple of weeks ago on the 2-year anniversary of the statement, the Harvard Law School paper that came out that really stated that the new statement was mostly for show. And their review was based on sort of a review of the number of bylaw changes that had come through. So while I'm no lawyer, I do question whether or not bylaw changes are needed before you can actually start to think about these stakeholder capital interests by companies and boards. I think we can agree that the tide fully into a stakeholder capital world is not here. This is a journey, and sort of where this journey takes us end point is still unfolding. But we know that investors, employees, are overlapping. The intersection between these various communities is growing increasingly. Our employees are becoming investors. Investors are also our customers. Everyone is now sort of looking at sort of the interests of the social and the environment as another community to advocate for. We're also seeing with technological advances, creating more communication channels, companies are able to hear and able to tap into the views of these stakeholders more than ever. And not only are we all managing and protecting sort of the social license of the organization to operate, but I do think that there's a purpose-driven sort of organization can balance off these trade-offs across all of the stakeholders and be rewarded with a competitive advantage. Getting closer to sort of like this particular sort of audience is where I think we want to go in this conversation. I do think stakeholder capitalism goes hand in hand with company purpose and also the approach to ES&G. And we've heard in some of the earlier sessions today the amount of mind share that's going towards ES&G in compensation. And so we're going to cover that off a little bit as well today, although maybe at a little bit higher level than sort of the earlier sessions. I do think there's a link in terms of compensation programs rewarding ES&G directly, and so you can see the impact of results into payout levels and whatnot. But it does also sort of indirectly impact and sort of play into the stakeholder capitalism sort of conversation. And so with that, maybe over to you, Judith. First question, sort of as we sort of pull into your experience on the director side of things, wondering if you can sort of just share with us sort of how you've seen broader stakeholder interests reflected in your boardroom discussions, and truthfully, if you've got any watershed moment or sort of aha following the Business Roundtable announcement.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you. I really like the way you have characterized it as a journey, because I think we've been on this journey for a really long time. Stakeholder interests beyond those of the investor or the shareholder have long been reflected in the boardroom discussions, but they've been reflected under an umbrella called responsible business or corporate social responsibility. We've been talking about competitive behavior. We've been talking about product safety. We've been talking about health and safety and employee training for a very long time. But for me, when I think back to the last 2 or 3 years, we've really ramped up our discussions. And I think the catalyst for it is Larry Fink's letter to CEOs. So Larry Fink, as you know, is the CEO of BlackRock, and every year he puts out a letter. And in 2018, he issued an open letter to CEOs about purpose. And then in 2019, he issued a second letter, and this was about the linkage between purpose and profit. And that was really, I believe, the impetus or the catalyst for boardrooms to take all our fragmented discussions on many of these matters and bring it together under an umbrella of purpose and stakeholder capitalism. And I'd suggest that it was really the impetus for the Business Roundtable to sign off on the statement of the corporation's purpose. And when I look back over the last 2 years, and I haven't done the in-depth study that the Harvard researchers have done, but when I just look at a few of the organizations, I'd say some of them have been quite progressive in meeting their commitments, and many of them have lagged. But that watershed moment that you asked about, I think the watershed moment has really been COVID and the need to shut down non-essential workplaces while continuing to serve customers that has really boosted our discussion and our focus on stakeholders in the boardroom. I can tell you that, in Canada, in Calgary, on March 13th, Friday, March 13th, 2020, is when all the employees were sent home. Downtown Calgary became a bowling alley, essentially. And we all very, very quickly turned our focus so that employees and their safety became number one, and customers and supply chains became number two. And investors were down in our priority immediately because we needed to focus on the short-term matters of our safety of our employees. But Michelle, I'd ask you the question. You have long sat in Human Resource and Compensation Committee rooms, and I'd ask you, what have you observed over the last 2-3 years? I've shared what I have observed. I'd be curious to hear what you've seen.
Yeah. When I think about it, I almost do a pre-COVID and a post-COVID sort of aspect. And when I think about sort of trying to get at this issue, I would say even before COVID, before we hit 2020, we were finding that compensation committees were spending less time on pure executive compensation, sort of the design, pay levels, and sort of the outputs of it, and a lot more time on the human capital management topics, culture, talent pipeline, succession, engagement. And I think it was Dina in the first session this morning, talked about even compensation committees changing over their name to try and get at this breadth of sort of areas where they are now sort of focusing their attention on. I would also say that pre-COVID, the question of what, if any, ESG or broader stakeholder measures could or should be included in the compensation program was starting to percolate at a lot of companies. But it didn't have a lot of urgency behind it at that point in time. I'd say since COVID, in the compensation realm, compensation committee meetings, very similar to what you're saying in terms of the boardroom, just broadly speaking, the health of the organization from a people standpoint took front stage center, and it was the only topic. So it was a piece that really just pushed all of the other topics out of the agenda, and people were still struggling. And so I would say at some level, compensation committee realized that the organization, the management team really was focused on the people side of things. And so anything that didn't have to be talked about got pushed off. We saw committee meetings actually sort of condensing in terms of timeframes too. I think part of that was also maybe the challenges of moving to the Zoom function and just people eventually having a little bit of Zoom fatigue. But I would say through COVID, I have never seen so many updates and detailed discussions on agenda items like benefits programs, mental health programs, and the conversations are not just focused on the market competitive nature of the benefits and the cost perspective, but really coming at it from the people perspective. And so really caring about what it is the organization is going to need to survive through this really upheaval sort of area. As well, on the question of ESG measures in compensation, I would say as well, what we're seeing there, COVID has pushed that conversation now to the front. I'd say the tail end of 2020, we saw a big uptake in companies looking to start to add or enhance ESG into their compensation programs. And it really did sort of create or have a sense of urgency now to it. So a conversation that maybe 2 years ago would have taken a full year, 18 months to get through. Do we want to do this? How do we do it? What are the metrics? How do we stress test the metrics? Those conversations got really truncated. And so boards were really pushing management teams to try and get some of these sort of things that they were really looking at and being a big focus of the boardroom and the committee conversations into the pay programs that we are seeing. And so I think that's driving some of the trends that we're seeing right now in terms of the enhancements of ESG and these broader stakeholder interests in all of the conversations. And maybe with that sort of piece of it, I wonder if we can sort of turn and sort of focus in on these broader stakeholder metrics in compensation programs what are you seeing, or what do you have in the different compensation programs at your companies?
That's a good question, because I have the privilege of serving in a number of different industries, from power and utilities to oil services to financial services to software technologies. And so what I'm seeing is that compensation metrics are really a function of the sector, the product and service, the ownership structure. That's really important. And to a great extent, the maturity of the organization itself. So, for example, my operating companies in power and utilities and in the energy sector have long had metrics to capture employee safety, employee training, and those types of metrics. And those would be different from, let's say, my financial services, the bank, where employee safety is not as critical as it is if you're working in a gas plant, but they're looking at customer engagement and cultural metrics, which is really about how do you deliver value to your banking customer. But the other thing I've observed is that private companies and public issuers, the for-profit, private and public, have much more flexibility in incorporating ESG metrics into the compensation plan than, for instance, crown corporations do. So to give you an example, I serve on an integrated electric utility in Atlantic Canada called New Brunswick Power that is owned by the Crown. And in Canada, it's quite common for utilities to be owned by the Crown. And so the Crown in New Brunswick prohibits the payment of any compensation beyond base salary. So there is no option to put ESG metrics as part of the compensation plan. So the board each year, and certainly the HRC committee chair, will sit with the CEO and will sit with the management team with the support of the committee and the board, and identify the ESG metrics that are important. And we ask that they be stewarded to, they be measured. We discuss them on an annual basis when we talk about performance, but we don't award compensation. And so it's a little bit different, is we're expecting performance, but we're not awarding because our hands are tied. On my other boards, we would have, for instance, a greenhouse gas emissions target. We may have preventable motor vehicle incidents targets. We may have injury reduction targets. We may have customer satisfaction targets. But I would say to those of us who have joined us in this conversation today, one of the places, if you're looking to say, what are the metrics that I should be considering, is to go to the SASB website. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. It's like FASB, but for sustainability matters. And they've put together a materiality map. And so they've identified for every sector, they've identified the dimensions and measures of significance that they believe is important. And it's a really good place to start. And keep in mind that increasingly investors, lenders, regulators are looking for public issuers to disclose their ESG performance relative to the SASB materiality map. So it becomes a really important tool for management and the board to look at and use as they develop their compensation, but absolutely as they steward their performance and they disclose their performance. What are you seeing, Michelle?
Yeah, that's great. And I think the examples are really helpful, just for the spectrum of where we can be in terms of the ESG and compensation. And I know I said earlier that this trend of enhancing ESG metrics into comp programs has taken off in the last 2 years. I don't want to miss the chance to call out the fact that many industries already have ESG metrics in their comp program. They've been around for decades. Health and safety, customer, environmental metrics, they have been there. We're just talking about them in a different lens. Flip the slide here. And I know everyone in the audience, you've been inundated with the data on the ESG in comp programs, and your eyes are probably already glazing over. But I did want to sort of pull out a couple of high-level trends and comment on some of the differences we see north and south of the border. And so here, what we've got on the top end, you can see that the prevalence of some kind of ESG metric in comp programs would suggest that Canada is ahead of the US, at least amongst our large indices. But I'd say a couple of observations. The gap is closing, and it's been closing rapidly over the past 2 years. I'd say the US has moved quicker on the ES&G sort of piece of it, a lot of it driven by the DE&I sort of move. And then the other piece here is that, sorry, as I move here, when we look at the ES&G metrics that are appearing in the program, there's an overwhelming majority of metrics in the short-term program. And so I think it was Dina who'd also mentioned that PSU programs, specific ES&G metrics aren't really showing up there. And so both in Canada and in the US, we've got sort of low single digits in terms of ES&G metrics in PSU programs that have that longer performance period. So at this point in the journey, we are still very much focused on that short annual performance period in the short-term incentive plan when we're talking about ES&G metrics. PSUs really do have relative TSR as sort of that primary financial metric in them. I would also call out that here in Canada, we've got an interesting case in the sense that many of our largest companies, and this is driven predominantly by our financial institutions, so the large 5 banks and a large number of the insurance companies as well, use their short-term annual bonus program to also size the LTIP grants. And so that it does sort of play into shorter periods of performance for ES&G metrics, having some kind of an input into the long-term incentive plan, but it really is on that front end sort of granting side of things rather than sort of measuring performance for an ES&G or stakeholder metric over a longer, say, 3-year period. Another interesting piece is the metrics themselves that are being used by companies north and south of the border. And for me, the biggest sign that sort of the US is probably ahead of Canada is the nature of metrics that are being incorporated into compensation programs. Many of the US sort of metrics have this bigger picture sustainability focus already at this point in time, rather than what we're seeing still in Canada is a bit more of the day-to-day operational focus. A lot of the health and safety, the employee engagement and customer satisfaction metrics there. The most prevalent stakeholder metric here in Canada is still safety. And it's not surprising when you consider the fact that our market is heavily dominated by energy, natural resource, so oil and gas and mining companies here in Canada. And while the categories sort of left and right on this page aren't directly comparable, I would say that the prevalence of customer satisfaction and employee engagement, a bit more of the operational sort of short-term metrics, are generally in line north and south of the border, and sort of that sort of comfort zone. These are metrics that we've seen in comp programs for a number of years. There's a comfort level to net promoter scores, employee engagement, and measuring the like. I would say one of the, in my personal view, sort of disheartening pieces in terms of the Canadian piece is at this point on the DE&I area, we are very much lagging in terms of having formal metrics in incentive compensation programs. We're at sort of less than 5 or at 5% across the TSX 60, our largest index. They're using this metric, whereas this has moved very quickly on the US side, and we're already up to sort of 28% in terms of S&P 500 companies. And when you look at sort of the top half even of S&P 500, that number goes up even further. When I think sort of just around sort of where to from here, and one of the conversations that we have with a number of management teams and committees, one of the challenges that we face is this idea that as we add new metrics, and truthfully, this is not just with ES&G metrics, it's with any new metric that's out there. As we add it to the mix, the impact of a single metric can be diluted. It's just sort of the way it is. And so the question, Judith, sort of from a board perspective, when you start to think about sort of the different sort of pieces here in a comp program, or just as you start to think around the discussion in the boardroom, is it enough to add in a stakeholder or ES&G metric even if it's coming in with like a relatively low weighting, say 10%?
You know, Michelle, it's a good question. I recall last year and year before, as we were looking at the metrics on one of my organizations, we were tussling with, well, if we add this, we have to reduce this. Is 3% enough? Should it be 30%? Should it be 5%? Right? So we tussled with those numbers, and the reality is, you're absolutely right. As we add metrics to the scorecard, it does mean that some or all that were previously on the scorecard have to be smaller to fit more in. And that's just the basics of math, right? But I'm not sure that dilution per se is wrong. I think executive teams have the ability to steward to several metrics of importance, and having multiple metrics, even if they're small weight, relatively speaking, sends the message to the organization, to the executive team, and to stakeholders that the board believes that there are several things that are important and must be managed and measured and stewarded to, and sometimes, where possible, perhaps not in my crown organization, but where possible, rewarded. And I don't think that there's a bright line on how to allocate weighting to financial versus non-financial metrics. My observation is that the amount you allocate to the ESG metrics, the non-financial metrics, really tend to vary by company, by sector, and by geography. And so my boards are Canadian based, although we do have operations in the US. They're headquartered in Canada, and so there's a Canadian lens on it and a Canadian competitive lens. So what I did do is I wanted to just better understand what the US would look like. So I compared two of the largest railway companies, so Union Pacific in the US with CN in Canada. And I looked at the proxies of both a couple of weeks ago. And what I observed is that both organizations had metrics for culture, for safety, for employee engagement, but the allocation on the Canadian company was somewhat higher than it was for Union Pacific in the US. And I think the reason that the Canadian CN has a slightly heavier weighting may be because of the somewhat different fiduciary obligations we have in Canada than we do, as I understand it, in the US, where the US obligation is to the investor or shareholder, and in Canada, it's to the corporation. And so it causes us to make slightly different decisions, but the underlying desire to have the management team steward to non-financial metrics is still there. But having said that, in Canada, we're starting on some companies to approach as much as 30% non-financial. And one of my boards, it's 70% financial, 30% non-financial. And we talked long and hard about that. And we've come to the appreciation that we're not stealing from shareholders to give it to stakeholders, because we've come to the appreciation that we need trained, loyal employees who want to stay and work. We need happy and repeat customers. We want regulators who believe we have credibility. We want communities that welcome us, and we need all of these things to deliver long-term returns to investors. So it really is about looking at both the short-term metrics, which may be more financial in nature, and balancing it with non-financials, which deliver long-term value.
Mm-hmm. I really like that. We're not stealing from shareholders to pay off the other stakeholders. We really aren't in a zero-sum game here. It is all working to the benefit of the corporation. And on that final point, I do have one more sort of follow-up question. I want to just make a mention to our audience, give you the heads up. If you have any questions come through the first little part of the discussion or areas that you want us to get into next, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A field. So before we go to that, Judith, my last point is on this issue of the trade-offs between conflicting interests of the various stakeholder groups. So how do you think through and how do you balance these issues and what's in the company's best interest? How do you prioritize one stakeholder over, say, another?
It's a good question. How do you navigate those trade-offs? I would say carefully. Carefully, I would say in a transparent manner, in an authentic manner. And as I think about it, let me give you two examples, one which was easy, one which was very difficult. So the easy one is one in which the board and senior management were able to grow the pie for all stakeholders. So everybody won. And that example is a company called AltaGas Canada. It was a public issuer on the TSX, and I served on the board. And when we started receiving unsolicited offers to purchase us, we immediately launched what I would say is a very disciplined process to identify all stakeholders. And then we evaluated every offer relative to the implication for each of those stakeholder constituents. And the offer we selected, which we believed was the best one, left every stakeholder, whether you were an employee, a customer, a shareholder, a regulator, the environment, every stakeholder we believed was better off post-transaction. So that was the easy one. But those easy ones aren't common, unfortunately. Usually it's pretty tough. And so directors and boards and management teams aren't always able to grow the pie for all stakeholders. And so that's where you have to really navigate the trade-offs. And so the most recent example in my mind is really when COVID hit us, and we immediately resulted in a material loss of revenue. And as board members, we had to make some very difficult decisions as to how do we contain costs when we've just lost our budgeted and our real revenue. And so one of the things we discussed is, in terms of cost containment, should we be laying off employees? Should we be rolling back salaries? And I will assure you that those were very painful discussions, and they were long discussions, and they were held over multiple meetings. It was not an easy decision to make. And two of my organizations, we made the decision to roll back salaries for all employees from frontline right through to the board. And the amount of rollback was a function of the seniority of the individual. So board members took as much as a 20% rollback, and frontline may have taken a 5%. So we were all in it together. Nobody was happy, but it was necessary. So it wasn't made lightly. It was made in the interests of the long-term viability. Needless to say, those boards that I served on and many others who made that difficult decision were criticized. And if I look at the US companies that made that decision, and I would pick on Salesforce, because Salesforce in August of 2020 announced outstanding financial results, but it came on the heels of laying off 1,000 employees as part of COVID restructuring. And so there was lots of criticism in Canada and the US about Salesforce being hypocritical. But what the CEO said was, he said, Salesforce is not a stakeholder nonprofit. Salesforce is about stakeholder capitalism. And that's really the truth, right? If stakeholder capitalism is going to survive and thrive, then investors have to survive and thrive. So in order to do good, you have to do well. And so I wonder, and I'd put this out to you and to those of us who've joined in the conversation today to think about, is would we have more clarity and less adversity when we have to make these difficult decisions if we use the term stakeholder governance rather than stakeholder capitalism? But coming back to the question, carefully, you have to make those trade-offs carefully.
Very carefully. And I really like the way that you've put that. I'm cognizant of time, and I do want to sort of make sure that we get into some of our audience questions. So Lisa, I'm wondering, you've been monitoring the Q&A there. If you could sort of jump in and help us queue up some of those questions.
Yeah, I thank you. And it works perfectly as I've been listening to you. I think the first question is an extension of the point that you were just talking about, and that is the role of the organization. And you talked about, who is it designed to support the stakeholder or the corporation, who's prominent. And one of the questions is, to what degree should corporations be in the business of solving societal problems? And let me put a slight twist on it and say, rather than just a yes or no, maybe to what degree should corporations be involved in, and businesses be involved in solving societal problems? It's just a small one to throw out to you all because
Michelle, do you want to take it? Do you want me to take it?
How about I start? How about you start, and then I'll chime in once I sort of gathered some thoughts here.
Okay, so I don't know that businesses have the responsibility to solve society's problems. So I'm not there. I'm not sure it's their responsibility to solve, but I do think that they have a role to contribute to environmental issues and to social issues. When we address things like employee health and safety, employee well-being, systemic discrimination, cybersecurity, sustainability, land, water, air stewardship, when we do those things, we are focusing on non-financial issues that support the creation of long-term value for investors and for stakeholders. And by doing so, I think we are contributing to solving some of society's challenges. So I don't believe it's business's responsibility, but I think business has a role to play.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything you said there, Judith, and maybe just a slightly different lens to add to it. I think at some level, societal problems can't be solved by any one constituent. I think businesses, together with government, with other stakeholders, are going to have to come together to figure this out. Whether it's society, whether it's the environment, climate change, they're big issues and they just take a lot of sort of inputs. I do believe that companies, as they operate, will have to price in the externalities of the costs of doing business to be sustainable and to sort of address some of these bigger issues. I think the idea, and this particularly I think might resonate with you, Judith, sort of with the Alberta background, oil and gas in Canada, we are just now starting to come out of into the world of, yes, let's figure out how to price in carbon. How do we sort of like provide retraining for employees across sort of Canada and North America in the face of AI or technological advancements? And I think in sort of getting at that bigger cost of how to do business, we will indirectly address, maybe not solve, but address some of sort of the challenges that we're seeing coming out of society's challenges that we've got in front of us right now.
I think you both gave some really good thought for us to consider. And what I'm hearing you say is that, and what I've heard you say throughout this whole session is that we're not existing in a vacuum. There are very big connections between what's going on in society and the things that we look at as organizations, and they need to be taken into account. But as no one constituent can carry the full day. I think if that's a good summary. Maybe we can go on to the next question that's in queue here. And let me go. We have a few questions in queue here. So there was a desire for you to follow up on the Salesforce CEO comment about not being a stakeholder, and could you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can't speak for the CEO of Salesforce, but I think what he was trying to get at is really around the need to address both short-term and long-term matters. And so what he's saying is, again, this is my interpretation of what he said, was really around, we have to make difficult decisions. We have to do trade-offs. If we put non-investor stakeholders, any one class of stakeholders as primary, then we may not be able to meet the needs of the other stakeholders, including investors. So I think how I interpreted when he said, this is not Salesforce is not stakeholder nonprofit. We still have to do well if we're going to continue to support all stakeholders for the long term. That was my interpretation of his response to the criticism.
Yeah, I've heard him speak on this subject on more than one occasion, and I would agree that, directionally, that's, what he intended. And sometimes this is where the quick sound bites can get in our way. And in the media, they don't always dig beneath the surface on some of these things. So, Michelle, did you have anything more on the first two questions you wanted to add? Or I think we only have time probably for one more question to dive in.
I think I can move to the next question.
Okay. So, these have been really complex topics that companies are grappling with. And from your perspective, how would you like the audience to leave this session appreciating the needs and priorities from the board perspective, right? So, because they frequently have noses pressed against the window. They're not in the comp committee room. They're not listening to the deep conversations that you all are having. And how can you help them appreciate what's going on a little bit more? So, Judith, clearly that one is designed for you first, but I know Michelle is frequently in at least part of those conversations, so I'm sure she can add to that as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be as quick as I can in the interest of time. I would say that the conversation in the boardroom is changing. It's continually evolving as a function of the operating environment is changing, as well as the changing expectations of shareholders and stakeholders. And so it's really, really important that board members come to the table with all of their experience, their expertise, their perspective, but recognize that the world is changing. And so as board members, we need to, as Alvin Toffler said, we need to learn, unlearn, and relearn. I love his quote. He said, in the 21st century, the illiterate are not those who cannot read nor write. It is those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so if I was to come back and if I was talking to the management team, I'd say to them, look, we have a lot to offer as board members, but we need your support. And how you can give us support is really helping us apply our experience, our perspective to the specific situation of the organization and the industry. So let's do some deep dives in some of the issues of importance, which obviously changes over time to the industry and to the company. Let's do field visits. Let's do site visits. Let's walk the floor. Let's bring in practitioners and experts into the boardroom and help us learn and unlearn what we thought we knew and relearn, and let us use our perspective, our expertise while we're serving on the board within the context of your organization. So I think it's a partnership between management and the board in terms of together learning, unlearning, relearning.
As a jumping off point from that sort of continued journey that we're all on, I would say that we in the audience, myself, as compensation professionals, I think we need to sort of take a look at how we define performance, success of the organization. How we get to the final results is going to be just as important to what that final result is actually itself. And so whether you or we are at the beginning of the journey for our clients or we're well into it, I think the idea of continually going back to first principles and reviewing compensation plans through the lens of various stakeholders is going to be sort of a part of the process that we have. And I think we might just be surprised at where it leads us here on out.
Well, great parting thoughts from both of you. Every single person who has joined us today, I think, can really take that back to their organizations, and also personally. I think these are the moments of reflection that are so important. So, I on behalf of our attendees live, those who will be viewing this on demand in the future. I can't thank both of you enough for the insight that you have provided. I'm reminding everyone that there are greater resources, excuse me, that Michelle's firm has provided, links and materials that can help you dive more deeply into the topics that have been raised in their virtual booth. And Judith, thank you for really meeting us where we needed to be as a board member and helping us consider how to move forward and support you and the organizations in the future.
Lisa, thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I've really appreciated hearing the perspectives of Michelle and those who have joined in the conversation. So thank you.